So today we're really going to break out of the Monroe Doctrine and we're going to see America enter into really European affairs for arguably the first time. Now, again, being fair, we see some of this with American imperialism. We're just not seeing it physically in Europe. And this does have tremendous impact on America. So our question for today is, how did World War I change the United States? Now, I do want to preface this conversation with, you may be bringing in a fair amount of World War I knowledge. That's great. I do want to include the caveat, though, College Board cares less about wars. So we are going to look at this not from really a perspective necessarily of the world or the perspective of military history. We're going to look more at domestic impacts on America. As I say that, we still do need to talk about why World War I happened. And so something you may have been taught before, and really the main way to approach this is the acronym MAIN. So these are causes of the Great War, as it was called: militarism, alliances, imperialism, and nationalism. Militarism is what it sounds like. You have a lot of nations building up their military power. We're going to see some modernish parallels to this with what we would call the arms race between us and the Soviet Union. But it's basically, we're going to build bigger and better, military equipment than you. Keep in mind, we're in that industrial era. Well, we're coming out of it. And so we have these advancements with technology that we really hadn't had before. And you can make some really significant changes. The reason why this leads to being a cause is if you have a lot of toys, you kind of want to play with them. And if you have a big military, you kind of want to use it. And you might feel like it's okay to use military power to kind of throw your weight around. Now, alliances are these agreements between countries that if someone attacks you, I'll have to come in to defend you, and then vice versa. The significance of alliances isn't that there are nations that are friendly, but it's really that we're basically building up two sides. And if one teeny tiny power attacks one other teeny tiny power, it can be these massive domino effects that's going to lead to the big countries getting involved in fighting each other, which is literally how the World War I happens. There's also imperialism. Just like America is flirting with imperialism, you have European countries doing this, specifically looking into places like Africa, and you see some in Asia, going about trying to get a foothold in lots of different parts of the world. Shout out, we're going to see the beginning of what we ultimately will know as the Vietnam conflict coming about, even before this, from France. But that's a side note. We'll deal with that in a future unit. Having colonies is a way that you can kind of move up the superpower rankings board. That's kind of a big deal. And if you aren't colonizing, you're showing that you're weak. And so that's what these countries are doing. But by doing that, they're also in competition with each other. And then finally, nationalism. Nationalism is kind of a love for your country, but also an adherence to my country is better than your country. And therefore, I'm willing to kind of fight for it, or I'm willing to enter into these competition things, pushing for my side. And that really is, look at that combination, the cocktail of I got a bunch of weapons, I'm trying to compete with people on a world stage. Some of them are my friends and some of them aren't. Oh, and my country's amazing. Yeah, that's not a great recipe for success. Now, let's break down these alliances here. You can see in green, the Triple Entente. You're going to have the UK, France, and Russia, primarily. Those are our main players. And then the Triple Alliance, you're going to see Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy. Now, without going to European history on you, Austria-Hungary is really a dying nation. Like, they used to be fairly substantial, and they're not. As you can see by the name, it's basically two sides, Austria and Hungary, being held together by a super old leader, Franz Joseph. Now, I read an actual whole book on just the schisms between this, and I'm not going to bring all that into this because, again, American history. But the key is you have a country that really needs to kind of push back against the rumors out there that they're not doing too good. And it's also important to keep in mind, think of like, and I'll make a connection to like celebrities, right? They need to be very public. They need to be out there. They need to keep their social ranks going up and things like that. They need to stay in the news. That's what Austria-Hungary is kind of facing. And then you do have Italy as well. Shout out Italy, I guess. Now, the place geographically that is the most significant is an area called the Balkans, and you can see it right there. Now, the irony is they're not the most significant because they're powerful. They're not. They're just the most significant because that's where you're going to have the start of World War I. So the Balkans are aligned with Russia. And again, without going into all of European history, you do have a lot of tension between areas in the Balkans and Austria-Hungary. Essentially, you have ethnic nationalities throughout Europe, but you have them in this area, especially the Serbs. And they want to have their own piece of land that has their ethnic people on it. And Austria-Hungary is kind of taking away some of that land. And so you see some cries within this ethnic group of, we want our liberation. And so ultimately what's going to happen is there's going to be a conflict in the Balkans that's going to lead to World War I. Now, you probably already know the situation with Archduke Franz Ferdinand and that starting it. And yes, that's correct. It is going to be this. The significance, though, is not just that someone died, but it's the kind of circumstances surrounding it. Franz Ferdinand is going to do this, like, show of force, look at the military, etc. as he goes here. And he goes to Sarajevo, which is in Bosnia. And this is essentially a middle finger to the Serbians. Like, this is basically bringing the military down near and being like, look what I got, you don't have it, that sort of thing. So, like, already, it's like, that's not a super great look. Like, that's a little antagonistic. They also are very public in newspapers about his route and where they're going. Don't do that if you're trying to be secure. And there's a terrorist group that wants to assassinate him. They're called the Black Hand. They are Serbian nationalists. So again, nationalism, but specifically Serbs who want to have a nation state for their own people. Gavrilo Princip is going to be the assassin. It's actually an interesting story in that the assassins try to throw a bomb into the car, and then someone catches it and throws it behind it, and it blows up the car behind them, and then they're like, oh crap, and they zoom away, and then they go down this winding thing, and everyone's like, oh darn. And then Gavrilo Princip is stepping out of a place where he was getting a sandwich, and he turns, and down the street coming towards him is the car, so he just jumps up and shoots them, and Franz Ferdinand is going to die. It's actually a little touching. He turns to the wife and he's like, you need to live for the children. She dies. Yeah. Now, that may be where your history stopped, and it was like, World War I. But let's look at this a little bit, because we're going to see, we've already seen nationalism. Now we're going to see how alliances played a part in this. Now, remember, Austria-Hungary is aligned with Germany. The Balkans are aligned with Russia. So Austria-Hungary, very mad about this. So they go directly to Germany, and they're like, hey, can we be kind of mean? And Germany's like, I got you, it's fine. So Austria-Hungary goes to Serbia, and they give an ultimatum. And this ultimatum is that the Serbian government is going to take steps to wipe out terrorist organizations within its borders. It also wants to suppress anti-Austrian propaganda, and they want Serbia to accept an independent investigation by the Austro-Hungarian government into the assassination. So let's kind of pull back for a second. So they gave these demands, and it was just this really long list of stuff they wanted. Some of this makes total sense, right? Like, hey, you should get rid of the terrorists in there, because, like, they kind of killed our guy. Makes sense. Maybe you should stop with propaganda. Okay, I get it. And Serbia agrees to almost everything. In fact, there's only one thing they don't agree to, and it's this independent investigation. And the thing that they say no to is Austria-Hungary has language in there that says, we, as Austro-Hungarians, we can send people into your country, past your borders, and you can't stop them from going in. Which, that kind of makes you not a country, right? If another country can come in whenever they want and tell you what to do, you kind of stop being a country. And so Serbia's like, well, no, we can't do that. And the ultimatum passes, Serbia doesn't do it, and Austria-Hungary opens fire on them. Each of these moments, there's times where you could step back and not have World War I. So right now, Austria-Hungary is attacking Serbia. Serbia's been attacked. They're looking at Russia and they're like, we had a deal. But Russia doesn't really want to have to get involved for Serbia. Like, who cares about Serbia? And Germany's a little bit like, Austria-Hungary, just let them, And you kind of see a really interesting thing. And it's something called the WillyNicky Letters. And so Tsar Nicholas I is the Tsar of Russia, and Kaiser Wilhelm is in charge of Germany. And what happens is they're actually related to each other. You can go all the way back to, medieval things of, and set up these marriages so that we can all be tied together. So they're actually cousins. And they have these telegrams going back and forth. And it literally is like texting each other in the middle of the night. They happen in the middle of the night. Sometimes they cross each other, and then you get a message, but then you have to respond to that, but then you respond, but then you get this, and then you're like, what order do I do it? And basically the fallout, or the things they talk about, are this. One, Germany's like, hey, like, they literally, Austria-Hungary, had someone get assassinated. Like, come on, they get to do something. And Russia's like, I really don't want to have to get involved in this. But they hinge on something really significant that we overlook. And it's something called logistics. This is actually fitting as we talk about the vaccine rollout and distribution, the logistics of that. Logistics are complicated. And what Russia is looking at is if they're going to have to mobilize their army, and they need it in, let's say, a month, they have to start now. They can't be ready to fight in a month unless they start mobilizing now. And so Nicholas is writing him, and he's like, all right, look then, well, like, we kind of got to get started, but I don't want you to think that we're trying to attack you, but we have to be prepared. And Germany's like, whoa, are you mobilizing? Because if you're mobilizing, we're going to have to mobilize. And basically what happens is they are concerned about needing to be prepared in the future, because what if you're not mobilized and someone attacks you? And they start to mobilize, and then the other side is like mobilizing, and then they're like, well, you're mobilizing, and then the war starts because of that. So we did a lot of European history. Let's look at America. America is like, we're neutral. Don't want to get involved. Monroe Doctrine, we ain't doing that. This has precedent. We saw Washington do it. We saw Jefferson do it. We are going to remain neutral. Kind of. We're kind of going to remain neutral. We do want to keep trading. We want to make money, and darn it, people at war sure do like to spend money. And this is going to lead to problems. And honestly, it's also World War II. Like, we'll see this a lot in World War II. In fact, I don't know if you could tell by the name, a lot of similarities between World War I and World War II. But it is important to point out, America not really wanting to get involved. You can see that sticker there, War in America, or War in Europe, Peace in America, God bless Wilson. So now we have all of these European countries involved, and you're going to start to see blockades put into place. So Britain has the most powerful navy at the time, and they're going to leverage that to blockade the Germans. If you look at the map of Europe, that's a pretty effective thing that Britain can do, because Germany kind of is landlocked on the south, and so they really need that access up north, and Great Britain can play a big factor in blockading that. Now, Germany doesn't like that, so they respond with their own blockade of Britain, and they threaten to sink any ship that enters into what is called the war zone. And I want to set the scene here for both World War I and World War II. There is going to be U-boats that are going to be used by the Germans, so submarines, and they're going to use that to their great advantage in really interrupting and destroying a lot of shipping going on. And if you look at this cartoon here, you can see that invisible hand of Germany under the water, and it's moving. You have to keep in mind, we take a lot of technology for granted. There was this inherent fear because you couldn't see the U-boats. So you will see cartoons play into this fear, and it was a legitimate fear for people. So let's bring the U.S. back in. We want to trade. And I think this cartoon is a masterful kind of look at this. So you have Uncle Sam walking around with a sandwich board. On the front, peace on earth, goodwill towards men. We're neutral. Neutral. Not getting involved. But then on the back, war ammunition for sale. Orders filled promptly. So we're saying we're neutral, but we're also willing to sell stuff. And we can claim neutrality in that we are willing to sell to both sides. And you can go, well, that makes you neutral. But the reality of it is, look, let's be honest, we're going to trade more with Britain and France. One, we kind of got longer history between us and them. And two, well, I mean, Britain is putting that blockade in, so it's kind of hard to get stuff to you. And so you will see the numbers sold and dealt with Britain and France dwarf that of the Germans. This also is going to include loaning money, which keep that in the back of your mind. In fact, keep all of this in the back of your mind. When we get to World War I, we actually legitimately will see America learn from their history. They're like, all right, we ended up getting dragged into World War I because of this. We don't want to do it again. So they don't do it, and yet end up still being dragged into World War II. So, darn it. there are some steps towards war. And one of them of significance is the sinking of the Lusitania. So you have this British, quote-unquote, passenger ship that we have Americans traveling on. They actually were carrying weapons down below. They're going to be sunk by the Germans. Now Americans have died by the hands of Germans. And America is dealing with the, technically, did we get attacked? What are we going to do? We start getting prepared. This is the National Defense Act, and we start focusing on this preparedness. Well, maybe maybe we should, just in case. Now, the election of 1916, Wilson is still running on this, and you can literally see it. He has kept us out of war. But we continue to see this unrestricted submarine warfare. The Germans are just kind of sinking stuff. They're not giving warnings. They're not allowing Americans to get off those ships. That's not happening. And there is going to be the Zimmerman telegram, often viewed as propaganda. You are going to see this telegram, essentially from Germany to Mexico, saying, hey, if you were to attack America and, help us, and we attacked America, I'm okay with you getting your Mexican cession territory back. But one of the other significant things that will happen is the Russian Revolution. And so essentially, in the middle of this war, Russia's like, nope, we're done. We're done with our own government. And they start tearing themselves apart. This is going to lead to the Bolshevik Revolution, and then we're going to start to see communism and socialism rise up out of the ashes of Russia. And so we'll pick back up with that later, but then Russia is just kind of like, we're not involved anymore. And so America will find themselves getting involved in war in Europe. We're going to look more at the domestic impacts for Americans during this war. We'll call it the home front. The reality and the actual fighting of the war for us is we get prepared, we go over there, we're there for a few months, haven't been fighting for a long time, and everyone's bogged down in that trench warfare. And we're just like, I don't know, we have numbers and we're fresh, and it kind of is perfectly timed and it carries over and the war is done. And then America's like, whoa, we won! Trust me, Europe does not take it kindly that we just come in at the end and then we're on the winning side and we're like, we did it. And they're like, the years before, all the people of ours who died, really? We're going to ignore that? Some significant things that happen on the home front. You have the Food Administration, which is run by Herbert Hoover. We're going to see him again later. War Industries Board, Fuel and Railroad Administrations, National War Labor Board. This is led by Taft. And this is going to where labor gets higher wages. They get 8-hour work days, more of those increase, and union memberships increase. And I want to go back to the Gilded Age. You had labor fighting hard for this, and they got nothing. The government did not care. And then, oh shoot, we really need people working because we're literally at war. You know what? Give in to their demands. And this is something that I really want to stress, and this is kind of for your life in general. When you're ever trying to negotiate, try and negotiate out of a position of power. If you have leverage in a situation, then you have more ability to control that outcome. And in this case, if the workers just stopped, well, then we'd have big problems. And so the government's willing to give in to some of these things. But we're also going to see a trend that we've seen time and time again, or before, and we're going to see in the future. And this is the Espionage and Sedition Act. And in Schenck versus the United States, you basically have a situation where it is codified in the Supreme Court that, the government can kind of restrict your freedom of speech during times of war. In fact, they can kind of take away some of your freedoms at times of war. And we're going to see this come up again and again as America continues to enter into armed conflicts. There's the Selective Service Act that is created, which is going to allow for a draft, which still around. So good luck, gentlemen. Sign up for that. Actually, you kind of have to. If you don't sign up for it, then you can't get scholarships to college, and you also can't legally work. So there is still racial segregation in the Army. W.E.B. Du Bois is going to believe that seeing African Americans fighting for American democracy will bring social change, and that doesn't happen. If any of you have seen the Watchmen miniseries on HBO, they actually have a scene where you have an American soldier receiving basically these pamphlets from Germany that are basically, these soldiers are black, that are basically like, why are you fighting for, America? We don't have any of the racism that they have there, and you should, push back against that. And I'm not going to lie, we're going to see several other formal, like, military engagements where you will see African-American soldiers fighting for America and then come back and be face segregation, discrimination, all of those things. But as I mentioned, the reality is we're really only in Europe for a couple months. In the ending of World War I, Woodrow Wilson wants to play a significant factor in the peace negotiations because he wants to set up this kind of, future world where we wouldn't fall into these conflicts. And these are called his 14 points. We often are going to see Woodrow Wilson and like liberalism and like self-determination and democracy kind of connected significantly. And it's because of things like this. The key in the 14 points is in trying to stop future conflicts. Now, if you're looking at this thing here from about 5 down, we'll say maybe 6-ish down, you really just have, how are we divvying up land? And one of the factors for that is something called self-determination. And basically that is, these ethnic groups in Europe should have the ability to create their own countries. They can determine for themselves these nations that they're going to have. And that was the thing that Serbs were pushing for. In the beginning of those 14 points are ways to prevent future wars. Open diplomacy. Let's not have secret alliances. Let's make it really clear where everyone stands. Freedom of the seas. Maybe don't let Germany go around sinking a bunch of stuff. Let people trade. That would super benefit America, of course. Remove economic barriers. This is going to be something we're going to see pop up in the ending of World War II as well. And it's the idea that if I have a business relationship with you, I probably don't want to shoot you in the face. Because darn it, you won't buy my stuff. And this is kind of where we're seeing America and like the world in general right now is we are in a globalized economy. And so there are probably, and there have been ways we're going to see countries try and leverage that to kind of exert force on a global scale, but it's not using like war like we've seen before. It's using economic forces. And a reduction in armaments. Let's just physically have fewer, weapons, materials, things like that. That'll make it less likely for us to fight wars. And at the Treaty of Versailles, none of that really happens. Because why should America get to pick, right? Woodrow Wilson also did not want there to have to be reparations or a guilt for the war to be laid out. But Britain and France, who have fought this war, and they have lost a ton, are like, nope, I'm out for my pound of flesh. And guess what? Germany started this war. And again, if we want to go all the way back, did they? I mean, they didn't help things. Did they start it? No. And so on this Treaty of Versailles, which is absolutely a term to keep in mind, there is a war guilt clause where Germany has to admit that it's their fault that the World War happened. There's also reparation payments. Germany is going to have to pay back reparations to these other countries. Fun fact, actually, America is going to get itself involved in this, in loaning money to Germany to help kind of, get this these economies floating in Britain and France. But ultimately, we're going to have to withdraw from that when we see our own Great Depression, and then everything's going to fall apart, but we'll get to that. And Wilson is kind of ignored, and we will have World War II. Right? So there's plenty of alternative history you can think about of what if we had the 14th, it doesn't happen. And what I want to end with here is how we can go from the Treaty of Versailles to World War II. Again, we're setting the groundwork there. We'll get to World War II later, but I really do want to stress how this Treaty of Versailles is going to be tied into this alternate history myth making of the Nazis that is actually going to blame Jews for this. There becomes this alternate view that actually the Germans were stabbed in the back. You get what's called the stabbed in the back myth, which you can see in this cartoon here from this clearly racist depiction of a Jewish person stabbing a German soldier, very royal, in the back. And that is going to be something that is peddled, that no, we had victory, but it was snatched from us. The Jews destroyed us. And they went and they sold us out. That did not happen. And you are going to see those economic problems that I mentioned. We will have them. We will also see them pop up in the rest of the world. And here you can see children playing with stacks of paper money instead of blocks because you have hyperinflation. And so it's important for us to end here and look at America has gotten involved in this situation of getting involved in European affairs. But I don't want us to ring that bell to end the Monroe Doctrine just yet. Sure, we get some connections and we're slowly tearing it down, but there is going to be a reaction out of this where America pulls back. We don't want to accept the Treaty of Versailles. We don't want to be dealing with these political situations going on. We do have some economic connections, obviously, but we really want to focus on ourselves. You'll see the Roaring 20s. We're going to crash in the 30s, and then we'll see Europe descend into chaos for World War II. Then we'll get back involved, and then we're really done. So if we're looking at the Monroe Doctrine, you can make an argument that World War I breaks it, but there's also a decent counter-argument that maybe a little, but then we pull back. It's not really going to be World War II until we actually see America step out as like a superpower on the world stage.